Chapter 1. The Pride of Japan. Yamato and Musashi. In the cold morning light of December 16, 1941, as the Empire of Japan stood at the height of its power, two colossal shadows loomed over the Kure naval arsenal. They were not just ships, they were monuments. They were the embodiment of Japan's industrial might, naval ambition, and national pride. Their names would echo through history with awe and tragedy alike, Yamato and Musashi. At the time of their completion, these two battleships were unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Yamato class was built in secret, under the strictest veil of wartime censorship. Their existence was known only to a select few within the Imperial Navy. Even the workers who assembled their massive steel plates often did not know the true scale of what they were creating. To the Japanese people, they were simply whispers, the super battleships. Yamato's keel was laid down in 1937, a year when Japan still believed it could challenge the world's great naval powers head-on. Every detail of her design reflected that belief. Her main guns, 9 18.1-inch monsters, were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. Each one could hurl the 3,200-pound shell over 25 miles with enough force to punch through the armor of any battleship afloat. The designers believed that no other navy would ever dare to build something so immense. Her armor was equally staggering. A 16-inch thick belt of hardened steel protected her sides, while the armored deck, almost half a meter thick, shielded her magazines from aerial bombs. On paper, she was nearly unsinkable, but Yamato's greatest weapon wasn't just her guns or armor. It was what she symbolized, Japan's dream of mastery over the Pacific. In her immense hull, stretching 862 feet from bow to stern, lay the hope that sheer strength could overcome any enemy. When Yamato slipped into the water on August 8, 1940, thousands of onlookers stood in silence. She wasn't just a ship. She was the empire itself, made of steel. Her sister ship Musashi followed soon after. Completed in 1942 at Nagasaki's Mitsubishi shipyards, Musashi was even more refined, heavier, slightly faster, and equipped with improved armor protection around her turrets. Together, the two vessels represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, but they were also built for a kind of war that was already slipping into the past. By the time Musashi entered service, the age of the battleship was dying. The aircraft carrier had become the true ruler of the seas. Yet the Japanese high command, steeped in traditional doctrine, clung to the idea that decisive naval battles would still be fought at gun range. Yamato and Musashi were meant to stand at the heart of that imagined clash, a modern Tsushima, where Japan would annihilate the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one thunderous exchange of broadsides. Reality, however, was less kind. When Yamato first left Kure for operational service in 1942, she was too valuable to risk. Japan had lost 4 carriers at Midway, and suddenly, the empire's naval strength was fragile. Yamato became the flagship of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, but her immense power was never unleashed. For most of her career, she sat anchored at Truk Lagoon, a fortress island in the Central Pacific, serving as a floating headquarters rather than a weapon. Her immense guns, designed to duel enemy battleships, remained silent. They never fired in anger against another capital ship. It was a strange irony. The world's most powerful battleship, built to dominate the ocean, spent most of its life waiting. Musashi, meanwhile, was not so lucky. In 1944, as Japan prepared for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history, Musashi was ordered to sea as part of the center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. She sailed from Brunei with Yamato beside her, leading a formation of cruisers and destroyers towards the Philippine island of Leyte, where American troops were landing. The plan was desperate but simple. Lure the U.S. Third Fleet away with a decoy carrier force, then crush the invasion fleet from behind. As Musashi steamed through the Philippine Sea on October 24, 1944, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted her column. Within hours, wave after wave of carrier-based bombers and torpedo planes descended from the sky. What followed was not a battle. It was an execution. Musashi's anti-aircraft guns roared into action, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke and tracer fire, but there were too many attackers. The first wave of torpedoes struck her port side, shuddering through the hull. Damage control parties scrambled to counter-flood compartments, but the hits kept coming. Dive bombers struck her decks, tearing through armor plates, igniting fuel, and killing men by the dozens. For 7 hours, Musashi endured a punishment no battleship had ever suffered before. She took an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Her armor, once believed invincible, was ripped apart. Slowly, she began to list, water pouring into her lower decks. Her crew, nearly 2,500 men, fought to the end, refusing to abandon ship until ordered to do so. At 7:35 p.m., the great battleship rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves. Over 1,000 men went down with her. When the survivors were pulled from the oil-slicked sea, they wept, not just for their comrades, but for what Musashi had represented. Her death was the death of an era. The Empire had lost not just a ship, but a symbol of its invincibility. Yamato's fate would come 6 months later, in even a more desperate act. In April 1945, as American forces invaded Okinawa, Japan's last defensive barrier before the home islands, Yamato was ordered on a one-way mission, Operation Tengo. She was to sail south with minimal escort, beach herself on Okinawa, and fight as a stationary fortress until destroyed. There was barely enough fuel for a round trip, and everyone on board knew it. When she departed from Tokuyama on April 6, 1945, her crew of 3,332 men stood at attention on deck. They saluted the rising sun flag and sang Kimigayo, Japan's national anthem. Many wrote final farewell letters. Some carved final words into the wooden bulkheads. They were not going to battle. They were going to die for their country. The next day, American carrier aircraft found them. Over 300 planes, Avengers, Helldivers, and Corsairs converged on the Yamato task force. The sky erupted in chaos. The Yamato's 150 anti-aircraft guns fired continuously, creating a storm of steel, but the attackers were relentless. Torpedoes struck one after another, flooding the engine rooms and knocking out power. Bombs rained down on the decks, igniting ammunition stores. At 2:23 p.m., after taking more than 10 torpedo hits and at least 7 bomb strikes, Yamato capsized. A massive explosion ripped through her forward magazines, creating a mushroom cloud visible for miles. Of her crew, only 269 survived. In that single blast, the last dream of Japan's naval supremacy died. What makes Yamato and Musashi tragic isn't merely their destruction, but the ideals they embodied. They were built for a kind of warfare that had already ended. Massive ships trading shells across miles of ocean. Yet by 1945, wars were decided in the air. By machines lighter than the shells Yamato's guns fired. The mighty super battleships had become dinosaurs in a world ruled by aircraft. Still, there's a haunting beauty in their story. In every rivet, every massive turret, every inch of that gleaming gray armor, there was craftsmanship, devotion, and pride. They were built by men who believed they were creating something eternal. In a way they did, not in steel, but in legend. Today, the wrecks of Yamato and Musashi lie silent on the seabed. Musashi was discovered in 2015 by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's expedition, resting upright at a depth of over 3,000 feet in the Philippine Sea. Her hull is shattered, but recognizable. Her giant gun turrets still pointed defiantly towards the sky. Yamato lies deeper still, near Okinawa, broken in two from the final explosion that ended her life. These wrecks are not just relics of war. They are reminders of human ambition, of what nations can achieve when driven by pride and desperation, and of what they can lose when blinded by them. In the end, Yamato and Musashi never fought the battles they were built for. They never faced their equals across the sea. Instead, they met their end under the wings of a new age. But the memory of their power and their downfall still echoes.
Chapter 2. The Fast Battleships.
Kongo and Hiei. When Japan's naval engineers looked at the ocean in the early 1910s, they saw not just water. They saw opportunity. The British Royal Navy ruled the seas then, but Japan, rising rapidly as a modern power, was eager to learn and surpass. Out of this hunger for dominance came the Kongo class, a line of ships that would bridge the gap between battle cruiser and battleship. And among them, two names would stand out through the decades: Kongo and Hiei. The Kongo was born from a fusion of ambition and cooperation. Her design originated not in Britain, but in Japan, the great naval innovator of the age. Built at the Vickers shipyard in Barrow and Furness, she was launched in 1912 as part of Japan's effort to absorb the best of Western technology. But when Kongo steamed into Japanese waters, she represented more than imported engineering. She was the proof that Japan could learn, adapt, and ultimately improve upon her teachers. Her name, taken from Mount Kongo, meant indestructible diamond. It fit her perfectly. Fast, deadly, and sharp-edged. She was followed by three sisters, Haruna, and Kirishima, all built to the same elegant but lethal pattern. At the time, they were classified as battle cruisers, trading some armor for speed. They could reach 30 knots, astonishing for ships of their size, and their 8 14-inch guns gave them punch enough to stand toe-to-toe with any opponent. When World War II erupted decades later, Kongo and her sisters were no longer young, but like aging warriors, they had been reforged for one last campaign. Between the wars, Japan modernized them extensively: thicker armor, improved engines, better fire control. The distinction between battlecruiser and battleship blurred. Now they were fast battleships, capable of keeping pace with carriers while still packing heavy guns. In the new age of naval warfare, speed was everything, and so the Kongo class became invaluable. There were the greyhounds of the fleet, escorts to carriers, night raiders, and last resort heavy hitters. For Kongo, the war began with triumph. She covered the invasion of Malaya, then the Philippines, her guns thundering against shore targets as Japanese forces surged across Southeast Asia. She steamed proudly alongside the carriers that struck Pearl Harbor. For years, she served at the core of Japan's expanding empire, witnessing victories that seemed unstoppable. He, on the other hand, carried a more complex history. After World War I, she had been demilitarized under the Washington Naval Treaty, her armor removed, her guns reduced, her might stripped away. For a time, she served as a training ship, a floating classroom for cadets. But by the late 1930s, as Japan abandoned the treaty system and rearmed, Hiei was reborn, reconstructed, refitted, and rearmed. She returned to sea like an old samurai unsheathing his blade once more. When the Pacific War began, Hiei stood beside her sister ship, Kirishima, as part of the Kido Butai's fast escort group. She participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, and the early glory days when Japan's navy seemed invincible. But the sea has a cruel memory. For every triumph, it demanded payment. That payment came in November 1942, the naval battle of Guadalcanal. It was one of the most chaotic, brutal, and intimate naval battles in history. Under the black tropical night, Hiei and her task force clashed with an American group led by cruisers and destroyers. The battle unfolded at such close range that sailors on both sides could see each other, faces illuminated by gunfire. Hiei's 14-inch guns tore through American ships, blasting holes through armor and decks alike. But the Americans were determined. Their torpedoes found their mark. Their 8-inch cells hammered the superstructure. One by one, Hiei's steering systems failed, her rudder jammed, her engine sputtered. By dawn, she was a crippled giant, drifting helplessly under relentless air attack. Her crew refused to abandon her until the end. As bomb after bomb fell, fires spread through her decks. Hiei, the resurrected warrior,
finally succumbed. She was scuttled off Savo Island, the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. The loss shook the Imperial Navy deeply. It was not just a tactical failure. It was a blow to pride. The Kongo class had symbolized speed and power, but Guadalcanal proved that even the fastest battleships could be overwhelmed by coordination, persistence, and air power. Still, Kongo pressed on. Through 1943 and 1944, she fought tirelessly at Midway, in the Solomons, and finally at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where she escorted the remnants of Japan's fleet in a last desperate strike. She had become an old veteran by then, scarred and weary, but unbroken. Yet fate was patient. On the night of November 21, 1944, as Kongo steamed through the Formosa Strait, an American submarine, the USS Sea Lion, lurked in the darkness. The crew of the Sea Lion could hardly believe their luck when radar contact confirmed the target, a Japanese battleship. They fired 6 torpedoes. 2 struck home. The explosions ripped through Kongo's hull, flooding her engine rooms. She slowed, listing heavily to port. For a time, it seemed she might survive. Her engineers fought to stabilize her. But then, a third explosion, internal, catastrophic, shattered the ship. Kongo rolled and sank, taking over 1,200 men with her, including her captain. Her end was quiet compared to the fury of her youth. No grand battle, no fiery exchange, just the cold silence of the deep. But even as she went down, she carried with her the story of a navy's evolution, from borrowed designs to self-made power, from triumph to tragedy. The legacy of Kongo and Hiryū lies not in their victories, but in what they represented. They were products of a time when Japan sought to match the West, to prove that it could master the technologies of modern warfare. In many ways, they succeeded. Kongo's design influenced generations of Japanese warships that followed, yet they were also reminders of the limits of human ambition. When Japan entered World War II, it did so with a fleet built on the romantic ideal of decisive surface battles. Dreadnoughts meeting in lines of fire, trading salvos until one side sank. The Kongo class was born for that world. But by 1944, the sea had changed. Battles were decided not by gunfire, but by aircraft carriers and submarines, enemies that could strike unseen from miles away. And so, the Kongo and the Hiryū died as relics of a fading era, beautiful, powerful, and ultimately obsolete. Today they rest far beneath the waves, their guns silent, their steel consumed by rust and coral. Divers who visit their resting places often describe an eerie serenity, the great cannons still pointed toward the horizon, as if waiting for an enemy who will never come. To stand before those wrecks, even through a camera lens, is to feel history breathing. You can almost imagine the roar of engines, the thunder of shells, the shouted commands echoing across the bridge. You can almost see the men, young, determined, believing that their ships were invincible. But the ocean remembers everything. It remembers the courage, the pride, the mistakes, and in the quiet darkness where Kongo and Hiryū sleep, it keeps their story alive, a story not of victory, but of transformation. They began as symbols of Japan's rise. They ended as witnesses to its fall. And between those two moments lies the story of an empire that reached for eternity and found only the sea.
Chapter 3. The Floating Airfields, Akagi and Kaga. When the age of battleships began to fade and the skies became the true battlefield of the Pacific, Japan stood at the forefront of a revolution. 2 ships, born not as carriers, but as reborn giants of steel, would define the dawn of a new kind of warfare. Their names were Akagi and Kaga, and together they carried the dreams, pride, and eventual downfall of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air power. They began life differently. Akagi was laid down in 1920 as an Amagi-class battlecruiser, while Kaga was planned as a Tosa-class battleship. But fate and an earthquake changed their destinies. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 devastated Japan, crippling its shipyards and damaging hulls under construction. When the Amagi was destroyed beyond repair, Akagi was chosen to take her place in history, rebuilt not as a warship of guns, but as a ship of wings. Kaga followed, redesigned under the same logic. By the time both ships were completed in the late 1920s, the world's navies were still trying to understand what aircraft carriers could be. Britain had HMS Hermes, the United States had the Lexington, and Japan now had Akagi, her flight deck stretching over 260 meters, her hangars stacked in 3 levels to maximize the number of planes. Kaga, more heavily armored and stockier, complemented her as the muscle of Japan's new aerial fleet. Together, they were the first test subjects in an entirely new theory of war, that control of the sky could control the sea. When the Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto became commander of the combined fleet in 1939, he saw what many older officers did not. The battleship's era was ending. He had visited the United States as a naval attaché and understood the industrial power America could bring to bear. If Japan were to win, it had to strike fast and strike first, and that meant turning the aircraft carrier from a support ship into the centerpiece of the fleet. By 1941, Akagi and Kaga were the pride of Kido-butai, Japan's first air fleet, the most powerful carrier task force in the world. 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of highly trained pilots, all operating as a single, coordinated weapon. No navy had ever assembled such a force before. In the early hours of December 7, 1941, Akagi's flight deck buzzed with tension. The sea off northern Japan was calm, a mirror under the stars. Pilots stood ready beside their planes, breathing clouds of white vapor into the frigid air. At 6 a.m., the first signal came. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The planes roared into the sky, their engines shattering the dawn's silence. Bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters climbed in formation, their shadows stretching across the water. Below, Akagi's flag flew high on her mast. She was the flagship of the entire operation, under the command of Vice Admiral Shuichi Nagumo. Hours later, Pearl Harbor burned. The success was overwhelming. In a matter of minutes, Akagi and Kaga's squadrons, along with those from 4 other carriers, devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships sank in their berths. Airfields were wrecked. Over 2,000 Americans were dead. Japan had achieved what few believed possible. But within the triumph lay a hidden curse: overconfidence. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical victory, yes, but it was also a strategic gamble. Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. In the months that followed, Akagi and Kaga dominated the Pacific. Their planes struck British forces in the Indian Ocean, raided Ceylon, sank cruisers and destroyers, and ruled the skies wherever they appeared. They were floating fortresses, and to the sailors aboard them, it felt as though Japan's empire stretched as far as their aircraft could fly. By the spring of 1942, though, cracks had begun to show. The Doolittle raid, a daring American bombing of Tokyo, humiliated the Japanese high command. Though the damage was minor, it proved that the U.S. could strike the home islands. Yamamoto needed to lure the American carriers into a decisive battle, one that would crush their morale forever. That battle would take place near a tiny, isolated atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Midway. In June 1942, Akagi and Kaga sailed once more at the heart of Kido Butai. They were confident, almost arrogant. The plan was simple: surprise the Americans, destroy their carriers, and occupy Midway Island to extend Japan's defensive perimeter. But Yamamoto's opponents were ready. American codebreakers had deciphered the plan. The trap was already set. On the morning of June 4th, Akagi's flight deck crews prepared for a second strike. The first wave of planes had attacked Midway's airfield but failed to completely destroy it. Reports came in that American ships were nearby, but conflicting orders left the hangars crowded with planes being rearmed and refueled. The decks of Akagi and Kaga were a storm of activity. Fuel hoses snaking across the floor, bombs and torpedoes scattered around as armorers worked frantically to reload. Then, out of a clear blue sky, the sound of engines roared overhead. American dive bombers, Dauntlesses from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, had found them. Within seconds, the calm turned to chaos. Bombs screamed down like falling stars. One struck Akagi near her midsection, penetrating the hangar deck. Flames erupted instantly, fed by open fuel lines and armed aircraft. Another hit Kaga, detonating her fully loaded planes. A third followed, then a fourth. The carriers became infernos. Men ran across burning decks, their uniforms aflame, their skin blackened. Pilots who had just climbed into their cockpits never had a chance to take off. The heat was so intense that steel melted and ammunition cooked off in violent bursts. By afternoon, it was over. Akagi drifted helplessly, her bow still proud, but her hull gutted. Kaga was engulfed from bow to stern. Admiral Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge in silence, watching the smoke curl into the sky. The same sky that hours before had carried his planes to victory. Now it was filled with fire. When the order finally came to abandon ship, many crewmen refused. Some chose to go down with her. At 5:20 p.m., scuttling charges were detonated. Akagi slipped beneath the waves, leaving only ripples on the surface. Kaga followed soon after. The loss of those four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū, at Midway, marked the turning point of the Pacific War. Never again would Japan's carrier fleet regain its former strength. The elite pilots who had trained for years were gone. Their replacements rushed into battle with barely a fraction of their experience. Yet even in defeat, Akagi and Kaga left an indelible mark on history. They had proven the power of naval aviation, showing the world that the future of warfare lay not in battleships and heavy guns, but in planes and coordination. The U.S. Navy would learn that lesson well and surpass it. Today, the wrecks of Akagi and Kaga lie over 5,000 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, discovered in recent years by deep-sea explorers. They are remarkably preserved, their decks still intact, their gun mounts still in place, and their flight decks resting quietly in the eternal darkness. They are tombs now, tombs for the thousands of men who lived and died aboard them. Tombs for an empire that believed it could conquer the sky. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The whine of engines, the whistle of wind over deck, the shouted commands in Japanese, and the thud of bombs striking metal. And then silence. The ocean is patient. It remembers everything. And deep beneath its surface, two great carriers still dream of clear skies, rising suns, and a world where steel could still fly.
Chapter 4. The Flying Cranes, Shōkaku and Zuikaku. In the shadow of Akagi and Kaga's burning wrecks at Midway, two other carriers still sailed the Pacific, proud, powerful, and unbeaten. Their names meant flying cranes: Shōkaku, the soaring crane, and Zuikaku, the auspicious crane. They were sisters not by birth, but by spirit, built to carry Japan's hope into a new age of naval warfare. If Akagi and Kaga were the old guard, conversions from battlecruisers and battleships, then Shōkaku and Zuikaku were the modern braid, designed from the keel up as aircraft carriers. They were Japan's response to lessons learned from a decade of trial, error, and innovation. Commissioned in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor, they represented the peak of Japanese naval design. Fast, sleek, elegant, their hulls stretched over 250 meters. Their engines could push them beyond 34 knots, faster than any American carrier at the time. Their hangars were spacious, their decks smooth and strong, and perhaps most importantly, they could carry nearly 90 aircraft each, giving Japan an unprecedented striking power. They entered the war as the youngest, most advanced carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and for a time, they seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor. The cranes take flight. December 7th, 1941, the morning that changed everything. While Akagi and Kaga led the strike, Shōkaku and Zuikaku launched waves of their own. From their decks roared Mitsubishi A6M0s, Aichi D3A Val dive bombers, and Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo planes. Their pilots were young, confident, and utterly devoted. The Shōkaku's planes struck Kaneohe and Hickam fields, tearing through American aircraft lined up like dominoes. Zuikaku's bombers soared toward Battleship Row, diving through flak and fire. Together, they helped cripple America's Pacific Fleet in a single morning. When news of the attack reached Tokyo, crowds flooded the streets in celebration. The Emperor's Navy had achieved what seemed like a divine victory. In Japan, children were taught to draw cranes in flight, symbols of luck and long life, while their namesakes hunted across the Pacific. But every victory carries a shadow. The pilots who launched from Shōkaku and Zuikaku that morning were Japan's elite, the result of years of training, discipline, and combat in China. They were the sharp edge of Japan's aerial sword. Yet they were also irreplaceable. When those men died, Japan had no way to replace them quickly. The Indian Ocean raids and the Pacific advance. In the spring of 1942, the flying cranes spread their wings again. Under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, they joined the massive Indian Ocean raid, a strike against the British Eastern Fleet. On April 5th, Shōkaku and Zuikaku's planes roared across Ceylon skies, destroying over 80 British aircraft and sinking several warships, including the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire. The British fleet retreated towards Africa. For a moment, the Imperial Navy seemed invincible. Japanese newspapers called it the Empire's brightest hour. The carriers had done what no navy had ever achieved, projecting power thousands of miles from home, striking at will. But even as the rising sun spread across maps of the Pacific, a storm was gathering, one that would come to a head at a place called the Coral Sea, the Battle of the Coral Sea. In May 1942, Japan set its sights on Port Moresby in New Guinea, a crucial stepping stone to Australia. If Japan captured it, Allied supply lines across the South Pacific would be severed. Shōkaku and Zuikaku formed the core of the strike force. Their mission: neutralize the American carriers protecting the area. For the first time in history, two carrier forces would clash, ships hundreds of miles apart, never seeing each other directly, fighting entirely through aircraft. On May 7th, both sides launched massive airstrikes. American dive bombers found and sank the light carrier Shōho, prompting the famous radio call, "Scratch one flat top." The next day, the Japanese retaliated. Shōkaku's bombers struck the USS Lexington and Yorktown, setting the Lexington ablaze. But the Americans hit back hard. Dive bombers from Yorktown pierced Shōkaku's flight deck with several 1,000-pound bombs. Flames engulfed her forward hangar. Her flight deck twisted and buckled. Her elevators jammed. Zuikaku escaped damage, but her air group was decimated. Her most experienced pilots gone. It was the first battle in history where neither side saw the other's ships, and the outcome was a draw on paper. But strategically, it was a setback for Japan. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands, and more importantly, When Japan planned its next major offensive at Midway, Shōkaku and Zuikaku were forced to stay behind, one crippled, the other without pilots. That absence would prove fatal to Japan's war effort. The long war began. After Midway's disaster, Japan's naval arm was shattered. The flying cranes were now the backbone of a fleet desperately trying to recover. By late 1942, both carriers had returned to action, participating in the brutal Solomon Islands campaign. Their aircraft dueled daily with American Wildcats and Dauntlesses. But this was no longer the confident advance of 1941. The Allies were learning, adapting, and producing. In the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, Shōkaku and Zuikaku faced a resurgent U.S. Navy. Their air groups struck and heavily damaged the USS Enterprise and helped sink the Hornet. It was a tactical success, but again, the cost was catastrophic. Each battle drained Japan's elite aviators. Each victory left fewer men to celebrate. By 1943, Japan's carriers were hollowed out. They still looked formidable on paper, but their decks were crewed by green pilots with barely 100 flight hours, a fraction of what American aviators had by then. And meanwhile, the U.S. had launched new carriers faster than Japan could replace a single one. The Essex-class behemoths began rolling off American shipyards like clockwork. The tide was turning. The final flights. 1944. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Shōkaku and Zuikaku sailed once more. It was their last great mission. Facing them was a U.S. fleet unlike anything seen before. 15 carriers, more than 900 aircraft, radar-guided fire control, and an endless supply of planes and pilots. The Japanese plan was desperate. Their pilots, many barely trained, flew outdated aircraft against American Hellcats and Corsairs. The result was carnage. American gunners and pilots shot down wave after wave of attackers. Entire squadrons vanished in minutes. Shōkaku, leading the formation, was struck by torpedoes from the USS Kavala. One torpedo ignited her fuel tanks, triggering a massive explosion. Fire consumed her decks. Ammunition detonated, and within minutes, the soaring crane disappeared beneath the waves, taking 1,200 men with her. Zuikaku survived the battle, but she was alone. Once the symbol of Japan's naval air power, she was now a relic among ghosts. In October 1944, at Leyte Gulf, Zuikaku served as flagship of Admiral Jusaburo Ozawa's decoy force. Her job was not to fight, but to lure the U.S. fleet away from the Philippines, while Japan's remaining battleships attempted a final strike. She launched her last aircraft, many piloted by barely trained youths, knowing they would not return. When American carrier planes found her, Zuikaku's crew fought bravely, manning anti-aircraft guns to the end. Bombs and torpedoes ripped through her hull, and as she listed heavily, the crew gathered on the deck. They raised the rising sun flag one last time and sang the Kimigayo, Japan's national anthem. Moments later, Zuikaku rolled to port and slipped beneath the sea. The last of the Pearl Harbor carriers was gone. Legacy of the cranes. Shōkaku and Zuikaku were not just ships. They were symbols of a philosophy that defined Japan's early victories and eventual defeat. They embodied precision, beauty, and discipline. Their crews were among the finest ever assembled, but they also represented the limits of a system stretched too thin. Japan could build magnificent carriers, but it could not replace the
men who flew from them. When Shōkaku and Zuikaku sank, they took with them the last remnants of the old Imperial Navy's soul. Today, deep beneath the Pacific, their wrecks rest side by side, discovered decades later by explorers who found their rising sun emblems still faintly visible on the metal hulls, silent, proud, broken. The cranes no longer fly, but their story endures, a story of brilliance and tragedy, of courage and fatal miscalculation. They were the flying cranes of Japan, soaring higher than any before them, only to fall when their wings met fire.
Chapter 5. The Shadow Hunters. Hiryū, Sōryū, and Ryūjō. Before the age of giants like Shokaku and Zuikaku, there was the Hunters, the lean, fast, and daring ships that carried Japan into the first great carrier battles of the Pacific. Hiryū, Sōryū, and Ryūjō were not the largest or most advanced of Japan's fleet carriers, but they were among the most dangerous. They embodied the deadly agility and precision that made the Imperial Navy's early air campaigns so devastating. Their names meant Flying Dragon, Blue Dragon, and Dragon Horse. In Japanese mythology, dragons symbolized mastery over wind and water. Fitting, for these were the ships that would unleash the fury of the skies. Sōryū and Hiryū were near twins, sleek and narrow, with long uninterrupted flight decks and minimal armor. They sacrificed protection for speed, a hallmark of Japanese design philosophy. Ryūjō, the oldest of the three, was smaller, built to skirt the limits of international naval treaties. She carried fewer aircraft, but proved surprisingly capable in early operations. When war broke out in 1941, these ships formed the backbone of Japan's carrier force. Their aircraft spearheaded attacks across Southeast Asia, Manila, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, striking with surgical precision. They were hunters, always moving, always deadly. At Pearl Harbor, both Sōryū and Hiryū's squadrons played key roles. Their pilots launched torpedo and dive bombing runs that crippled U.S. battleships and airfields. Ryūjō, stationed in Japanese waters, awaited her chance. When it came, she joined in the invasions of the Philippines and Burma, proving herself a reliable workhorse. But 1942 brought a shift in fortune. At the Battle of Midway, the hunters became the hunted. On June 4, 1942, Sōryū and Hiryū sailed alongside Akagi and Kaga under Admiral Nagumo's command. They launched strikes on Midway Island, hammering airfields and defenses. But as with their sister ships, chaos followed. At 10:25 a.m., U.S. Navy dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown pierced the skies above them. Within minutes, Sōryū took 3 direct hits. Her hangars, packed with fueled and armed planes, erupted in catastrophic explosions. She sank within hours, her decks a sea of fire. Hiryū fought back with astonishing ferocity. She launched 2 counterstrikes, crippling the Yorktown with precise hits. But the retaliation was inevitable. By late afternoon, American bombers found her too. 4 direct hits sealed her fate. Flames engulfed her decks, and as night fell, her crew scuttled the ship to prevent capture. Ryūjō carried the torch forward, operating in the Aleutians and later in the Solomons. But by 1942's end, the tide had turned. In the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, she was caught by U.S. aircraft from Saratoga. Bombs tore through her deck, and within hours she capsized and sunk. The dragons of Japan's early carrier fleet were gone, swift, fearless, and doomed. They had fought with skill unmatched in the early months of war, but their design philosophy, prioritizing offense over defense, left them fatally vulnerable. Once the element of surprise was gone, they could not withstand the storm. Their loss at Midway in the Solomons marked more than just the destruction of ships. It marked the end of Japan's dominance in carrier warfare. From that point on, the Imperial Navy would never again field such an elite and experienced air arm. Today, the resting places of Hiryū, Sōryū, and Ryūjō lie scattered across the Pacific seabed, twisted metal shapes silent beneath the waves. They are relics of a time when dragons ruled the skies until fire and steel brought them down.
Chapter 6. The End of the Empire's Wings. Taihō and Shinano. As the war turned against Japan, the Imperial Navy sought to reclaim the skies with a new generation of supercarriers, ships that could withstand the brutal realities of modern warfare. Among them rose 2 names meant to inspire awe: Taihō, Great Phoenix, and Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built in Japan. They were not just warships. They were Japan's last, desperate attempt to turn the tide. Taihō, commissioned in 1944, was a masterpiece of engineering. She was Japan's first carrier with an armored flight deck, a direct response to the lessons of Midway.
She carried 65 aircraft and featured advanced radar and ventilation systems. Her designers intended her to be unsinkable, the Japanese answer to the American Essex class. But fate, as always, had other plans. In June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Taihō led the fleet proudly into battle. Her decks launched wave after wave of aircraft against the U.S. Navy, but American submarines prowled the waters below. At 10 a.m., the USS Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes. One struck Taihō amidships, rupturing her aviation fuel tanks. At first, the damage seemed manageable. The ship continued operations, but improper damage control, sealing ventilation instead of venting fumes, caused gasoline vapors to accumulate throughout the ship. Hours later, a single spark ignited them. The explosion ripped Taihō apart from within, turning her into a floating inferno. By afternoon, the Great Phoenix was gone, taking over 1,600 men with her. She never truly had the chance to rise. Shinano's story was even more tragic. Originally laid down as the third Yamato-class battleship, sister to the Yamato and Musashi, she was converted into a carrier after Midway, a decision born of desperation. Displacing over 70,000 tons, she was the largest carrier ever built during the war. But Japan had no time left. Shinano was rushed to completion. Her crew untrained, her watertight doors unfinished, her systems untested. On November 28, 1944, she left Yokosuka for her first voyage, without full sea trials, without escort, under cover of night. Lurking beneath the waves was the USS Archerfish. The American submarine fired 6 torpedoes. 4 struck true. Shinano began to list. Her inexperienced crew failed to contain the flooding. Within 7 hours, the mightiest carrier ever built by Japan rolled to her side and sank into the dark, carrying over 1,400 men and all her promise into the abyss. The loss of Taihō and Shinano symbolized the collapse of Japan's naval dream. The empire that once commanded the Pacific now faced a relentless storm of American industry, thousands of planes, carriers, and pilots that Japan could no longer hope to match. When the war ended in August 1945, the rising sun no longer flew from carrier decks. The dragons, cranes, and phoenixes were gone. The sea that had once carried Japan's power now held their tombs. But beneath the tragedy lies a legacy of brilliance, of courage, innovation, and sacrifice. The Japanese carriers changed naval warfare forever. They proved that air power, not battleships, ruled the oceans. From Pearl Harbor to Midway, from the Coral Sea to the Philippine Sea, their stories trace the arc of a nation's rise and fall. And though the empire's wings were broken, their echoes still haunt the deep, where the shadows of ships like Taihō and Shinano drift in silence, reminders of how high Japan once soared and how far it fell.